Welcome to the event, Night at the Coliseum, A History of Political Conventions in Chicago, featuring former United States Secretary of Commerce, Bill Daley, journalist and author, Jonathan Alter, Chicago Tribune columnist, Ron Grossman, and longtime Chicago journalist and political consultant, Don Rose. This event will be moderated by the IOP's founding director and former senior advisor to President Barack Obama, David Axelrod. My name is Oliver Zajac, and I'm a first-year student in the college, majoring in political science and urban studies. I'm excited to welcome tonight's speakers, each of whom is an expert in the history and politics of this unique city. Secretary Daley is a Chicago native who led the Department of Commerce under President Clinton and has worked in Illinois and Chicago politics for over 40 years, including serving as the co-chairman of the 1996 Democratic National Convention Host Committee. He lives to this day on the north side of the city, a fact I know because a local campaign I was working on called him just this weekend to get out the vote. Jonathan Alter is a best-selling author and Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker, known for his writing about American presidents and currently a contributing correspondent to NBC News, as well as the producer of the newsletter Old Goats Ruminating with Friends. A professor turned newspaper reporter, Ron Grossman's weekly articles highlight pieces of Chicago history and contemporary social commentary, often focusing on forgotten or under-discussed movements in the city. Don Rose, a sometimes critic and sometimes ally to prominent Chicago politicians, is a journalist who has written for publications around the city, was once a press secretary for Martin Luther King Jr., and represented protesters at the 1968 Democratic Convention. Finally, our moderator tonight is David Axelrod, the founding director of the Institute of Politics. Before our panel begins, I have a few housekeeping notes for everyone. Please be sure to silence your cell phone. Also, at the end of the event, we will leave time for questions. So when the time comes, please line up behind the microphones that will be placed in the audience if you would like to ask a question. As usual, we will give first priority to students. In addition, we have a quarter full of great events. You can join us tomorrow night at 5 o'clock in Bond Chapel, which is next to the Divinity School, for our event Burning Tech, The Master Speaks with Kara Swisher. On Friday, there will also be a live taping of the Axe Files with Sister Simone Campbell in the IOP living room at 10 a.m. And with that, let's give a warm welcome to our speakers today, Don Rose, Ron Grossman, Jonathan Alter, Bill Daley, and David Axelrod.
That was our walk-on music. Well, it's great to be home. Good to see you all back at the... And I'm going to be uncharacteristically disciplined, or try, because we have a lot to cover. There were 25 political conventions in the city of Chicago before the one that we're going to have this summer. And it turns out that a lot of them were historic at a time when conventions actually had the capacity to be historic. That changed. We'll talk about that at the end. So I'm going to try and speed date through the first 6 we're talking about, and then spend a good deal of time on the one that everybody remembers, the Chicago Convention. That, I don't know, there seem like there are a few people here who might be old enough to remember it, actually. So we will... So we will...
55 years.
Well, and then we have a few provocateurs here who remember it very well. So let's start with the convention of 1860. That's slide number 2 there. And that was held at a building called the Wigwam that was built just for this occasion. And the gentleman on the left is William Seward, who was the odds-on favorite to be the nominee. The guy on the right you may recognize without the beard, and ended up as the nominee. Ron Grossman, first of all, the Wigwam itself. Tell me about that, because I think it was built in 8 weeks on the banks of the Chicago River.
It was a very large fire trap. The whole thing was made out of wood,
and it proved its worth or lack of worth, because 9 years later, the whole thing just burnt down. It was built special for the convention, and if you look at the plans for it, it's obvious that the city founders thought if they hooked this convention of politicians, they could do the same thing with other kind of groups and make a living. Well, the fire cut that out nicely. So there it is, and the guy on the left there, Abraham Lincoln, found himself there in 1960 and wondering a little bit, what am I doing here? Because the night or so before the convention, he went up to see the editor of the Tribune and said to him, I think the Tribune boys have got me pegged up a little too high here. What if we go for vice president? And the editor said, or so the revealed truth is, we ain't playing second fiddle to anybody in this dance. He also had the problem that his wife didn't think he had any business being there because she wanted to be out and making a living by riding the circuits and picking up money in the courts. You know, I would go through and wave like this, just like you see in traffic court today. But he prevailed, he stayed, and Stuart was the favorite. But the editor of the Tribune had prepared for this. He had come here specifically because he thought that, as Lincoln would later say, a country can't survive half free and half slave. And he somehow picked out Lincoln as a person to carry that message. And a couple years before this, he sent him on tour with the real favorite son of Illinois, which is Senator Douglas at that time. And they tramped around the country and spoke, and that made Lincoln a name. He also gave high school students an infinite number of term papers ever since, because the Tribune hired a stenographer to go with them, and that's why we have the text.
Let me just interrupt you to say that we think of Lincoln, and John Alter, you may want to jump in on this. We think of Lincoln as Honest Abe. This was not exactly a pristine event. The way that Lincoln ultimately prevailed in this convention, because Seward was the abolitionist voice in the country. He was most powerful, Senator Seward, most powerful anti-slavery voice in the country, and it was just assumed. I saw a thing in the Harper's Weekly at that time, and it was a preview of the convention, and Seward's photo was huge in the middle, and then there were all these little photos around him. I think Lincoln's the smallest of all. So
he did amazing personal myth building, and he also played a very slick game of politics. On the latter one, he pretended like he was going to cut no deals to get the nomination, but he had his people offering Simon Cameron, who was from Pennsylvania and controlled the Pennsylvania delegation, Secretary of War, which he got the job. And Lincoln said, who, me? I'm not offering anything to anybody.
So the team of rivals was
that was starting at the convention. And then he also remember they called him the rail splitter?
Yes.
So they actually had people going into the wigwam with rails that supposedly he had split, but he hadn't. It was fake. But it
guaranteed and signed, $35 each.
Right. We all need good PR, man.
So, and the team of rivals thing is important because several of the people, Salmon Chase, several of them ended up in his cabinet, and some of it
Seward.
As a result of Seward himself as Secretary of State. But obviously, this was a huge hinge in history. Let's go to 1896, I should say. So the country had come through a very deep depression. It was in large part connected to the gold standard and speculation around gold, and our currency was pitched to gold and our gold reserves, and this was deeply felt particularly in rural areas and among working people, 25% unemployment. And the Democratic Party had the White House. Grover Cleveland was the president. He was leaving. And William Jennings Bryan was a 36-year-old former congressman from Nebraska who came there ostensibly to push a platform to move away from the gold standard, to add silver into the mix, to try and inflate the currency. And Don Rose will appreciate this, not because he was there, but made perhaps the greatest populist speech ever, the Cross of Gold speech. And you can maybe see some of the language, the ultimate.
You shall not press down on mankind this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify it on a cross of gold.
Exactly, exactly. But you read the rest of it that doesn't refer to the gold standard, and just his reference to the working class versus the money class. Remember, this was the Gilded Age. So he makes this speech, and he apparently intended it this way, but he makes this speech and he storms the convention. He's not a candidate going in, he's the nominee going out, 36 years old, still the youngest nominee in the history of American major party politics, and he became the nominee 2 other times. He was Secretary of State under Wilson. Ron, the thing I learned when I was looking into this is this all happened a few blocks from here.
Yes. That's the Coliseum of those days. And it was at 63rd and about Stony Island. Huh. I owe that to Alderman Burke. I one time was going to put it in the paper as second base on the diamond inside of the ballpark, and he straightened me out on that, so we owed it to him.
And that's how you learned where it was? He didn't handle the property tax appeals, right? Anyway, we move on. Let's go to 1912. 1912 was such an interesting Republican convention here. The Republicans had the White House. William Howard Taft, he had been Teddy Roosevelt's designee to succeed him when Roosevelt reluctantly decided to give up the presidency in 1908, and quickly became restless and unhappy, and came back and tried to take the nomination back from Taft. And Ron, how did that go?
If you look at the two of them, they are different in every aspect, starting from what their tailors would see. Teddy Roosevelt was a fitness freak. He hunted, he climbed, and all of that. And Taft ate. That was his unique sport. He weighed about 400 pounds. So much so that, I don't know if you saw it, but last week I did something on St. Patrick's Day, and when they brought him here to speak at the founding dinner of the Irish Society, they had to build a special chair for him. Besides that, Roosevelt was generally committed to reform. He thought that, as he put it, the malefactors of great worth control the country, and it's sort of true. The farmers sit there, and they're worried, is the railroad going to send the cars to get our stuff, our crops to market, and are the market makers going to give us an honest bid for our stuff? It was so intense that Western farm communities virtually seceded from both parties. They formed what were called populist parties, and they had the original idea of getting off the gold standard and allowing silver to work too. I had a course in economics at IIT for economics for engineers. It was not that strict. I have no idea what it does. You'd be on a silver scale, but gold scale, but it worked. It worked. When he made that speech, that ended the populist parties and made him the nominee. Now, what it also did is It scared bejesus out of the malefactors of great worth, and they ran against him, and he lost.
So, go ahead.
Well, I mean, it was the big, people talk about third-party candidates this year, you know, and in recent elections. This was the biggest in modern American history.
Yeah.
I think when
Because what
Roosevelt
we should-
bolted,
yeah.
he bolted the convention,
yeah.
the Republican convention. He took all his people with him, and they kind of cooled their heels for a few days, and then the next week they reassembled at the Coliseum and created this progressive party. And Roosevelt said, "I'm as fit as a bull moose," you know.
Right.
And so they call it the Bull Moose Party. And they adopted a lot of what had been in William Jennings Bryan's
Yeah, that's what's interesting. He
platform
ran
in
against him in
1896.
1908.
Yeah, and so it was very progressive.
I'm sorry, 1900. Go ahead.
Yeah, campaign finance reform and direct election of senators, all these things
Well, what would a forerunner of Social Security?
yeah, and
universal
also
health care.
Universal health care. So people,
Yeah.
when Obama finally got Obamacare, and you know, a lot of people said, "Well, he didn't get single payer," and like my response to that was, the American progressives have been trying since 1912
Yeah.
to get this done, and it took a full 100 years. But it started with the Bull Moose Party
Yeah.
platform, and they did other progressive things, like Jane Addams gave the seconding speech for Roosevelt, who was a big war lover, and she was a pacifist. But there was all this talk about, you know, letting women into politics,
Mm-hmm.
and that also happened with the 19th Amendment in the
should
next
point-
few
we-
years.
First community organizer.
Jane Addams,
Right.
yes. We should point out that Roosevelt ran, and there were 13 primaries. Roosevelt won 12 of them, and one of the causes of outrage was that he had won all these primaries, and party bosses basically controlled the convention and handed the nomination to Taft. As Ron says, I think their political sponsors were eager to stop Roosevelt. Roosevelt got 27% of the vote. He got 88 electoral votes, by far the most successful third-party candidate ever. So when you hear discussions about third parties today, recognize that Teddy Roosevelt was pretty formidable, and he didn't get anywhere with it. Very hard to succeed. So let's go on to 1932.
Let me make one more point.
Yeah, sure.
1912, and now this is an issue, that's late compared to other countries. Germany had a complete system of social welfare, including medical care, old age retirement, insurance against being unemployed. And the author of it in the 19th century was Otto von Bismarck. Try saying that the word progressive after it, just doesn't work. But he did it because he realized it was a viable issue, and so they had it long before us.
In 1932, we were in the teeth of the Great Depression, the beginning of the Great Depression. Both conventions were here that year. John,
So-
the Republican convention
Yeah.
renominated Hoover,
Right,
and then
it was a
this
snooze.
convention.
So before, I'm going to just say something very brief about two other conventions in between,
Oh, my
both in
gosh.
Chicago, super brief. So
I'm trying to move us along,
1916, the Republicans nominated Charles Evans Hughes to run against Wilson for his second term. It was the first and only time a Supreme Court justice has been the nominee. That happened in Chicago. In the 1920, also on the Republican side, they nominated Harding in the Blackstone
smoke-filled room.
Right, Blackstone
Yes.
Hotel. That's where the idea of a smoke-filled room comes from, on the 10th
The
ballot.
convention was deadlocked.
Yeah.
The story actually about that was interesting, which is all these senators, there was a group of senators that got together and decided they were going to nominate their colleague Harding. And they asked him if there was anything in his past that would disqualify him. He retreated to the bedroom and came out half an hour later and said no, which should have been a warning of something. Talk about 1932.
Okay, so this, I do have to discipline myself because I literally wrote a whole book on Roosevelt in 1932 and 33. So Roosevelt was the governor of New York but he was not very popular in the Democratic Party. He was derided as a lightweight. They called him Feather Duster Roosevelt. They called him the corkscrew candidate because he was always like, he thought a corkscrew was the shortest distance between 2 points. He repudiated the League of Nations, which pissed off the liberals. But he got his campaign manager, Jim Farley, who was an exalted ruler of the Elks, the Elks Club headquarters at Diversey in Lakeview, and this literally is how we got the nomination, because Farley went around the country and he assembled 140,000 Elks to be their base going into this convention. And then, but Roosevelt had strong opposition from his fellow New Yorker, Al Smith, who he had succeeded as governor, and they had this terrible feud.
He was the nominee in 1928.
He had been the nominee in 1928. He wanted it again, and Smith ended up walking out of the convention when he didn't get the nomination, and basically he cut a deal with this guy named William Gibbs McAdoo, who was Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law, had been his Treasury Secretary. And this guy, there's a lot of dispute as to how Roosevelt got the nomination on the 4th ballot. It was a very close call. He almost was not nominated. People didn't think he was healthy enough to be president. They didn't know the extent of his disability, but they knew he was lame, and they thought he didn't have the energy and couldn't do it. A lot of Democrats felt this way. It's a little bit like with Biden. Like a lot of people in the Democratic Party said, this guy's not up to it, we have to nominate somebody else. But they went ahead and nominated him, in part because he understood the crisis of the Depression. So at this point, the Chicago teachers had not been paid for 5 months when the convention opened in the summer of 1932. And you had 20 banks just in Chicago that had collapsed. So meanwhile, Al Smith is talking about, like, happy days are here again because of we got to get rid of prohibition, which is sort of like talking about happy hour on the Titanic. He was like really off message, and Roosevelt ended up getting the nomination, and he then gives this famous New Deal for America.
Well, let's roll this, because I have questions about this. Go ahead.
I have started out on the tasks that lie ahead by breaking the absurd tradition that the candidate should remain in professed ignorance of what has happened for weeks until he is formally notified of that event many weeks later. You have nominated me, and I know it, and I am here to thank you for the honor.
That's magic every time you hear it.
That in so doing, I broke traditions. Let it be from now on the task of our party to break foolish traditions. We will break foolish traditions and leave it to the Republican leadership, far more skilled in that art, to break promises. This convention wants repeal.
So now he talks about prohibition. At the end, he said I wanted actually just to get to the end point, but let's stop right here.
Okay.
But I want to ask you a question, because you know too much.
I know, it's the problem on this particular thing.
I want to, but you talk about the concern about Roosevelt's health. He mentioned there, he was the first president, the presidential nominee, to address the convention and accept the nomination, because the tradition was you'd send a delegation to tell the presidential nominee that they'd been nominated, and he said, which they all knew. So was it to show his virility, to show his energy, that he flew from Albany to Chicago?
Partly. So remember Len Dupre, the great
former alderman
from this area. So
there are a lot of students who probably don't. But
he was one of the great aldermen in the history of Chicago, and he was at the 32 convention. I interviewed him for the book, and he said throughout the whole convention, no enthusiasm for Roosevelt. They thought he was for the reasons I mentioned. So he needed to do something to electrify the convention. And remember, this is only 5 years after Charles Lindbergh has flown over the Atlantic. Aviation is new. It would be like landing at the convention, you know, in a space shuttle or something like that. The idea that he flew to the convention, appeared there in person. It had never been done before. So Lincoln didn't go to the wigwam, for instance.
Right.
He didn't even meet his vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, until after the election. These guys, they maintained a distance until Roosevelt flew in and accepted this nomination in person. He went right from Midway to the Chicago Stadium.
Everybody
where
on the flight got sick, but him apparently.
And Eleanor, who liked flying.
Yeah.
And Eleanor had not wanted him to run. She was totally against it. She threatened to leave him if he ran. It got seriously messy in their marriage. But she loved the flight to Chicago. And then he gives this electrifying speech, which transformed everything, basically got him elected right then. And the New Deal, which was just a kind of a...
He mentions it at the end of
At the end, it had been kicking around. It had been in a New Republic article or something. Suddenly, it just sticks. It's not like he had a big marketing team to impress it. It caught the moment.
All right. Go to 1940.
Wait, could I make a personal
Yeah, sure.
note? Roosevelt was a god in my parents' house. We had every possible picture of him hanging up. It wasn't until adult life that I realized that the man was a cripple. It was never shown that way. They very carefully manipulated him in and out, just like they had to do with me, as a matter of fact. And so that came as a shock.
Well, that also was a function of a different media environment in which there was an understanding between the media and the White House about when they could photograph the president, where they could photograph him, where they could film him. Let's go to 1940, and Bill, you'll take particular interest in this. Roosevelt now, John, he is seeking he is in line for a third term. He doesn't want to ask for it because it breaks the tradition that George Washington said of only 2 terms, but he knows the war's coming. So he has a letter read at the convention that he dictates to Alben Barkley saying, I am not asking for your nomination. I want, and basically
pick whoever you want.
Pick whoever you want. And then what happens?
That was phony, though.
Of course. What happens after that?
So Barkley reads this letter, and the convention isn't sure what to do. Like Roosevelt had told Farley, his campaign manager and his postmaster general, I'm not running. Nobody has run for a third term ever in American history. Washington set the tradition of only 2 terms. It's now a constitutional amendment after Roosevelt. So you run, Farley. So Farley wanted it. Some other guys wanted it. But then what happened was...
Let me just read. I can read it. The president has never had and has... This was what was read. The president dictated it to him. The president has never had and has not today any desire or purpose to continue in the office of president, to be a candidate for that office, or to be nominated by the convention for that office. He wishes in earnestness and sincerity to make it clear that all of the delegates in this convention are free to vote for any candidate.
Yeah.
Right. The reason I've got this thing on is this is a press pass from the 1940 convention. It looks like the Congressional Medal of Honor, but it's what they used for press passes in those days. So, it looks like it's going to be this really weird convention. Nobody knows what's going to happen. But FDR realized the month before, when France fell to the Nazis, nobody else can do this.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you right now.
And then what happens is, you're going to say what happened?
Well, no, I want you to say what happened.
Okay.
What happened in the instant after this letter was read?
Right after the letter's read. Suddenly, there's a guy on a microphone. Nobody knows at first what it is. His name is Thomas Gary.
We want Roosevelt.
And he is the head of streets and sanitation in Ed Kelly's political machine.
Ed Kelly
was the mayor.
We'll see him in a
very
second.
close to Roosevelt. I have a letter from Roosevelt to Ed Kelly. And suddenly you're hearing this over the mic. We want Roosevelt.
Guy's in the basement with a microphone. He was signaled.
So he controls, they called it the voice of the sewers.
Yeah.
That's what the press called it. So suddenly,
And then we should point out there were 200 city workers spread throughout
Yeah.
the arena
This was all
to pick up
rigged.
the chant. When he started, it was all
right, it was all
prearranged.
orchestrated. And then suddenly the other delegates are hearing, we want Roosevelt. And then everybody's going, we want Roosevelt. And they drafted him, quote unquote. But he, he had orchestrated it all behind the scenes.
You know what? As an aficionado of Chicago politics, Bill, though, you got to love the story.
Well, if it wasn't for the patronage, you wouldn't maybe have Roosevelt lead the country through the Second World War.
That's right. City
Well,
workers, they changed the world.
You and Don can talk about
that's
this
true.
later.
The machine saved civilization and democracy. Because if Roosevelt
first
hadn't
time.
been elected, he wouldn't have been president during World War II.
I think we actually have about a few seconds of Ed Kelly speaking, the mayor.
The Chicago Stadium is the setting for the Democratic Party's National Convention, assembled to nominate a candidate for the presidency of the United States. Amid scenes of enthusiasm, Chairman Jim Farley calls the convention to order, and the mayor of Chicago rises to nominate President Roosevelt for a third term.
We will stand and put forward and confirm again that God sent guardian of our liberty, the kind of man that mankind needs, our beloved President Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Yeah. So it was Ed
So
Kelly's
Roosevelt
guy in
is
the
still very
Kelly's guy in the basement with the microphone. So this would be a good reason to have conventions in Chicago, right? We're efficient.
That was was known as the Kelly-Nash machine.
Yes.
Which its opponents used to call the Nellie Cash machine.
Let's go to just very quickly, gang. 1952, and it was that was a year, 20 years of Democratic administrations, come through the war, come through the Depression. Truman was leaving office, very unpopular, and the Republicans recruited Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was a god for having led the invasion of Normandy and the decisive battles in the war. So it was a very, very difficult task. Adlai Stevenson was the governor of Illinois. He did not enter the convention as a candidate, although President Truman apparently wanted him. He was a reluctant candidate, and he made an opening speech to this convention, and over the course of the convention, and partly on the basis of the speech, he became the choice.
Talk about I brought a bunch
Maybe we
of
don't have
buttons
to
that people can see, come up and see afterward if you want. Illinoisians' favorite son, Stevenson. Wow, not good, but it worked. And I also have a pin. It's of a shoe.
John will have a souvenir stand.
I've got a souvenir stand.
After.
But I just want to tell the shoe story because it became very big in '52. So there was a photograph of Stevenson from kind of like the photographer would be right there. And he had a hole in the sole of his shoe. And that became kind of the symbol of Stevenson working so hard. He couldn't beat Eisenhower, obviously, but that he should be the guy the Democrats went for in '52, and then they did it again in 1956, also in Chicago. And he opened up the convention.
For the vice president.
Yeah.
John F. Kennedy was a candidate for vice president. But the only thing I want to say about that was in '56 was when he famously said, when someone shouted from the audience, "Every thinking man in America is for you, Governor Stevenson," and he said, "Yeah, but I need a majority." So let us now go. Let us now turn to 1968, and we are lucky to have with us two people who have unique perspectives on 1968. And from very different vantage points. Bill Daley was sitting in the convention hall and accompanying his father around, Mayor Richard J. Daley, during that period of time. Don Rose was on the street helping lead the protest. I think, Don, you would have been indicted with the Chicago 7 if you had had to cross state lines to participate. Yeah, good for you. Another reason to live in Chicago, I guess. But I want to talk about what was going on outside and what was going on inside. So let's, before you roll the tape, hold the tape. For you younger folks, you've studied the history. Others have lived it here in this room. But 1968 was a year like none other in my lifetime, and I think maybe in the whole history of the country, it felt like things were coming apart. President Johnson was driven out of the race for re-election by a peace candidate, Eugene McCarthy, who did well in New Hampshire. Bobby Kennedy got in the race. Over the course of the race, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and Bobby Kennedy was assassinated shortly before the Democratic Convention when he won the California primary that night. And it seemed like all of these forces were descending on the city. There was tremendous dissension and unhappiness about the war. Don was involved with that. And these forces collided on the streets of Chicago, and the story was very much inside the convention hall and especially outside the convention hall. This is David Brinkley talking about it.
Chicago at Balbo and Michigan Avenues. There has been in progress for some time a peace demonstration. The police have come to put it down. The National Guard has been called to help.
Don, you were out on the streets.
I was out in the street.
Tell me about, first of all, the planning for this, and what did you anticipate happening?
Well, we started, I was press secretary for the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, which was one of the two larger organizations planning to demonstrate and against the war, et cetera, along with civil rights protests. There was also a group called the Yippies, who were kind of Dadaists and doing things like nominating a pig for president and so on. We were planning, we started planning for this in November of '67. And we planned a series of events. We wanted a march. We wanted to have a demonstration within eyeshot of the convention, and so on. And all through this period from early '68 through all the terrible things that happened, the killings and so on, we kept trying to deal with the city to get a marching permit, to get a parade permit, to get a place to stand within eyeshot or earshot of the convention, all of which was turned down. Our final effort, we had on that Wednesday morning, we planned a large, Wednesday afternoon actually, we planned a large meeting at the in front of the band shell, the old band shell.
In Grant Park. In Grant Park.
In Grant Park, yes. And
the Democratic headquarters was in the Conrad Hilton.
Yeah, and well, we had a whole episode the night before at the Hilton with, that was the first big confrontation. And we had already experienced the nightclub and the nightsticks of the police in Lincoln Park and so on. So we were quite a bit wary. And without a parade permit, we planned to march. We had wound up with something close to 10,000. We planned to march and obey all the traffic signs, march on the sidewalk and obey all the traffic signs, which we had done successfully during the civil rights era when we had marched on City Hall and so on. And that was legal. There was a big disruption by the police in the middle of at the beginning of the rally, and they suddenly disappeared after clubbing 30 or 40 people very seriously. Anyway, we started assembling to go to take the march to the convention hall, and I since as a Chicagoan, I was there to help them show the way on the easiest route, walking down the sidewalk, and we get over to Balbo, and they stopped us. And we kept saying we're going to walk on the sidewalk. We can do everything legally and so on and so forth. And we were halted for at least an hour when all of a sudden we hear some explosions and start smelling tear gas. And everybody breaks up there. I made it across the bridge. I happened to have a press credential because I had a newspaper here in Hyde Park at that time. And by the time we get to Michigan Avenue, and some took different routes, it really, the tear gas was really ugly if you ever experienced it.
So this
just broke up that thing, and we get to...
I don't mean to interrupt the narrative, but the gist of this was there was a huge confrontation, police marching on the demonstrators, confrontation.
Oh, yeah.
You were the one who encouraged this notion of the whole world is watching.
Yeah, I coined that.
And was that, was this whole thing planned as a television event?
To an extent. I mean, we knew we were going to be covered. I mean, we were covered in the course of the whole year.
What was the goal?
The goal was to get to the convention and make our protest against the war, hoping, but I don't think anybody seriously thought that they would not nominate Humphrey, that they would...
Vice President Humphrey Johnson.
Vice President Humphrey. George McGovern was the choice of the former Kennedy people. And we were hoping to get some votes for him there, and just get there and make our yelling known. Mm-hmm. We really didn't plan on any violence.
Let me interrupt, Bill.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you're sitting there with your dad. We're going to see a picture of you, and I can say this because I'm follically challenged myself. But you had a lot more hair back then.
Really?
And you were a lot younger.
We all did.
But you were there, and your brothers were there on the floor. And just tell me, what were, from your vantage point, what did your father know? What was he thinking? You're sitting in the convention almost of the time.
Yeah. First of all, you can't just take what happened at Balboa, Michigan in isolation. Obviously, David mentioned what happened in the country and the world. I mean, the Paris riots, youth riots, Russians invaded Czechoslovakia and nobody did anything. So you had this world, seemingly surely America, boiling over, and the top was taken off in Chicago. But you can't just take what happened at that moment at Balboa, Michigan. You had a run-up. You had a run-up in the country, not just that year, but we had race riots throughout the country in 66, 64. So you had enormous amount of disruption going on in the country. My father saw his role.
Discontent.
And enormous discontent. You had 500,000 kids in Vietnam, and the country had turned against it. Even people who had been strong supporters of it and of the president, and he was chased out of office. Anyway, so the days running up to the Balboa, Michigan fiasco, you had tear gas in hotels, not by the cops, and you had this sort of crazy sense going on in the city from Saturday or Friday leading up to the Wednesday night Balboa, Michigan event. So even, I'll give you an example. We grew up about a mile from the amphitheater, which was on the south side of 42nd and Halsted.
Which is where the convention.
Where the convention was. And one morning I came out of the house, going somewhere. This was a couple of weeks before the convention, and an Air Force jet went over the house like at treetop levels, like crazy. And that night, there were pictures Dad brought home, sort of that were taken of the area for security purposes. That's how crazy the sense was of the country. But we were in the convention hall when this actually happened, and you didn't have. I had a phone in a briefcase that you could call an operator, answered, and said, connect me with something. But there was no instantaneous knowledge of what was going on. So people were saying there's a riot, and we were like, what's going on? It wasn't like the walkie-talkies that the cops had or others had only worked basically in the building. So there wasn't the sense that, and I know there was maybe a perception that my dad was there saying, okay, pick that one, I'll go get him, blah, 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 blah. But it was kind of crazy to us that this had all broken down at Balboa, Michigan at that moment. But there was as much chaos on the floor of the convention, a political chaos going on, that he as a political leader and trying to help Humphrey get the nomination was as important in some ways to him.
Can I interrupt you here? Because I know you have some knowledge here of your father, presumably, he was very close to the Kennedy family. Bobby Kennedy had won 2 primaries the night that he was assassinated. Presumably, your dad would have pushed for his nomination.
Right.
But he also had an alternative plan before he endorsed Humphrey. Talk about that.
Saturday night, I was 20 years old, and so I was part of the host committee, and the California delegation arrived at O'Hare. They had a charter plane from LA. So I was there to greet them, BS. And I did have this phone in a briefcase. So Jess Unruh, who was the chair of the California delegation, comes down the stairs, and I said, Mr. Unruh, I'm Bill Daley, my dad welcomes you to Chicago. He said, I need to talk to your dad right away. So I literally opened this briefcase, gave him the phone, hung up. I didn't listen to the conversation. I go home that night, and went back to change to go out, because Saturday before the convention, a lot of parties. And my dad says, don't go out. I said, why? He said, because we're going to endorse Teddy Kennedy tomorrow. And I'm like, what? He said, yeah. And the Illinois delegation met on Sunday, and they postponed their vote. And he and Unruh were trying to put it together. Sunday night, he went for the final tour of the convention hall, amphitheater, and I was with him, and we had a trailer that he could use, and there was a phone in it. And Kenny O'Donnell, who was one of the Kennedy advisors, and Steve Smith, Teddy Kennedy's brother-in-law, were at the Standard Club under probably Grossman and somebody else's names. The Standard Club was a Jewish club, so there weren't a lot of Irishmen hanging around.
I wouldn't have gotten in.
Yeah.
And he called them and said, is this guy in or out? And this was Sunday night. And he said, it was, I don't know if it was Smith or O'Donnell, said he's out. So he hung up the phone. He said, we're going with Humphrey tomorrow. And that was Monday then he endorsed him.
So, interestingly, he would have had Kennedy lived and he endorsed an anti-war candidate, there would have been a different feel, Don, would there not have, at the convention?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And had that happened, the whole structure would have been different. I think by the killing of Kennedy just sent everything up for grabs all around the country. Yeah. And who knows? We might have walked arm in arm out with Mayor Daley.
I doubt it.
Yeah.
So what was going on outside the convention was known to the news media because they had reporters out there. There were incidents like this within the convention. Oh, this is a young Dan Rather.
Push me, please. Sir, I know you won't, but don't push me. Take your hands off of me unless you plan to arrest me. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Walters, you can see.
I don't know what's going on, but these are security people apparently around Dan, and obviously getting roughed up.
I tried to talk to the man, and we got bodily pushed out of the way. This is the kind of thing that's been going on outside the hall. This is the first time we've had it happen inside the hall. I'm sorry to be out of breath, but somebody belted me in the stomach doing that. What happened is a Georgia delegate, at least he had a Georgia delegate sign on, was being hauled out of the hall. We tried to talk to him to see why, who he was, and what the situation was. And at that instant, the security people
Well, as you can see, put me on the deck. I didn't do very well.
I think we've got a bunch of thugs here, Dan. If I may be permitted to say so.
Well, mind you, Walter, I'm all right. It's all in a day's work.
Well, I saw the performance, and it didn't look very good from here, I'll tell you that.
All right, okay.
I was not far from this actual incident, okay? And this was the first convention where credentials were really important. They didn't have magnometers, to walk through, but there was because of the assassinations and all that. This is the first real convention with security credentials, and security people that really were over the top. Even the '60 convention, which I was at with my dad, was nothing. It was crazy. He had no credentials. The security people were taking this guy off the floor. They were trying to confirm whether or not his credentials were real. I was about 10 feet from this. Dan Rather was a great reporter, and he was a real good fall guy. He could fall real well.
So let's I can see the clock, thanks. Let's take a look at this speech, and you remember this well. This is Senator Abe Ribicoff making a nominating speech for George McGovern in the convention, referencing what was going on the streets.
The youth of America rally to the standards of men like George McGovern, like they did to the standards of John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. And with George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago.
Now, the issue remains the war.
With George McGovern, we wouldn't have a National Guard.
There's your brother, Rich.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a photo, I think, up there. Isn't that you in the upper right? Yeah.
So here's the story. What really pissed everybody off wasn't, and again, this was going on while the chaos was at Balboa. On Friday, the Illinois delegation, which my dad was the chairman, had a rule that nobody but the candidates could address the convention, the delegates, which was supposed to meet on Sunday, the event that I mentioned, that he postponed the endorsement of Humphrey because of the possibility of Kennedy. Ribicoff comes to his office on Friday afternoon with McGovern to see him and pleads with him to please let Ribicoff says, who knew my dad, let me introduce McGovern at the delegation. So I said, sure, Abe. I was there. It was like everybody was friends. He gets up there at Sunday when he introduced McGovern and throws up all over how great my dad was. You elected Jack Kennedy, you Illinois delegates, Democrats, you made Kennedy. If it wasn't for Kennedy, yada, yada, yada. It wasn't for Daley on you. And then 3 days later, this is the evil umpire. So that energy, that really pissed everybody off, along with those words, obviously. One last story. In '72, when McGovern's running, I'm on a plane with my dad flying to Washington, okay? This is in the general election, during the general election. So we're sitting in the plane, and I see Ribicoff get in and sit down in the front seat with an empty seat next to him. So I tapped my dad. I said, there's Ribicoff. So I was figuring, I got to watch this thing. He gets up, after the plane gets up, he walks up and taps Ribicoff on the shoulder and says, Abe, how are you? I thought the poor guy was going to drop dead right there. And he sat down with him and talked to him about the McGovern campaign and how, McGovern's got a And he came back.
McGovern's the nominee.
The nominee of the Democratic Party at the time. He came back, sat down. I won't tell you what he said to me, but anyway. It was interesting. But that's part of what the anger was about that.
I'm already being chastised for going over long because we do want to take questions. I just want to make a point here. This convention, there was mystery about this convention. There was some question as to what the verdict of the convention would be. Hubert Humphrey had not run in one primary in the whole election, and he was nominated by party leaders who cast aside the primary vote. A commission was appointed after, headed by George McGovern, and changed the system to where delegate selection was largely relegated to primaries and state elections. All these conventions that we've talked about here tonight, these that were historic in nature, Jonathan Alter, that's not going to happen in the modern era under the rules that were promulgated. And this convention probably did as much as any to promote those changes.
Right. I mean, I was 10 years.
Turning point.
Yeah, I was 10 years old running underfoot. My mother was for Humphrey, my father was for McCarthy. I didn't know that when I became a political reporter, and you and I met in 1984, by that time, these were just TV shows.
Right.
They were just scripted, you know, and journalism conventions where we would all see our friends, and they became meaningless.
Shows, yeah.
In terms of actually selecting the nominee. And so it's much less exciting, I think, even though the system that we have now is more small d democratic.
So, Don, let me ask you a question. I don't mean this to be provocative. I hope this is not the case. But given all of the things that are going on in the world, do you have concerns that at least what happened on the street could happen again, or that, I mean, there's so much.
That's a great question.
It depends on how the city reacts. We have people right now who have tried to have marches and places to stand and protest, and the city, under this great progressive mayor, has rejected them all and given them alternative routes that will take them miles away from where the convention is being held. Now, if that continues and more people come in, you know, we don't know where the war is going to be in
Gaza,
in Gaza and by November, but if the turmoil...
Well, this will be
in August.
This will be August.
Well,
yeah.
That's right. So that's very soon. And it depends on the reaction of the city. If the city keeps rebuffing it and people are feeling, you know, they're going to protest anyway, they may act up, the cops may act up, and so on. I see a lot of parallels, although at the moment, I think the anti-Israeli war faction that would be criticizing the Democratic Party currently is certainly not as large as the anti-Vietnam War was. But I see a lot of parallels of this taking place in miniature, and I would say largely up to Mayor Johnson.
We have a migrant issue in the city
as well.
The
migrant issue is another.
And we don't know where that's going to be.
Yeah.
All right. Do I have time to ask questions? I do. Great. And there's a microphone over there. So anyone who is interested in asking questions should, and students first, please.
I don't see anyone behind me. I'm an alum, if that means anything. I just have a question. What is the relationship between the DNC in Chicago specifically that has allowed Chicago to see so many conventions hosted here? What is the relationship between the DNC and, say, the institutions like the mayor and the police that may have, you know, and set up the stage for what we saw happen in 1968?
Well, you know, one thing I should have said was that, I mean, Chicago was a convention city because it was a center of the country and it was a convenient place for people to gather. I mean, there were other elements to it. That's no longer, you know, so that you sort of raised the why is Chicago. It wasn't like an inside game where Chicago had these committees wired. It was really just a matter of convenience that Chicago would be a convention town. But
And you had a minor struggle between the Pritzker people who won and the Johnson people who lost for running the convention.
But the question is, what's the relationship between the Democratic National Committee and the campaign? It's really the campaign.
Yeah.
Yeah, the campaign picks it. The president picks it. Clinton picked Chicago in '96 to have his convention here, and Johnson, because my dad wanted it, and my dad believed, quite frankly, that if Johnson wanted that nomination in '68, he still could have gotten it, in spite of the chaos and the craziness, because of the makeup of the delegates.
But it still doesn't answer the question. Yeah. The question is that there is a high level of coordination between the campaign, the city and state, and I think between government agencies that are concerned about security. And I think you'll see that here.
Yeah, the government, the federal government, is setting out the parameters and the lines past which you can't go. The what they call perimeter around the convention.
Is there someone in the balcony who has a question? I've been told that there's a microphone up there. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks for all being here today. My name is Robbie. I'm a first year at the college. So I'm curious what you all think in terms of how Chicago as a city is going to approach possibly cleaning up the areas around the convention to make it look, good to the press and the public. Because I've heard just either events in the past where it's like it's done in a way where it doesn't resolve any issues. It just maybe pushes people who are unhoused out of the area. What do you all think on that?
Look at it. Yes, in '68, to be frank with you, there was a lot of that sort of painting, fencing, that sort of stuff. And in '96 also. You're having the world come to look at your city if you're the mayor, and you want it to look good. Right now, I would say with the United Center in that area between the Loop, or downtown near North, where most of the delegates will stay and the press will stay, to the convention center, is very different than it was 60 years ago. There isn't that sort of need for, quote, cleaning up.
But Bill, can I ask you a question about that? There was a good deal of sort of urban renewal, or whatever you want to call it, before this '96 convention on the west side of Chicago that opened the door to the gentrification of the west side of Chicago. So there was displacement of people. I mean, it was Skid Row, basically.
Well, Skid Row had been leaving, do
you think it would have happened
way before '96?
You think it would have happened naturally?
Yeah, it had happened. It had happened. That movement of changing the near west side was happening way before '96.
The critique of what went on in '68 was not that they were trying to clean things up, but that some of it was a facade, that they were creating a Potemkin village.
Yeah, true.
Yeah,
that's exactly what was.
Anyway, but I think that the area between downtown and the convention has sort of been gentrified over time. I don't know what the city's plans are, but I don't expect that there's going to be like a high volume of change between now and the summer. But your point is well taken. Yes.
Hi, thank you all for being here. My name is Lindsay. I'm a first year in the college. And during 2020, we saw, because the pandemic was largely virtual, we saw a lot of recordings, and it almost seemed like a televised event as opposed to more of a live, in-the-moment convention as we've seen it before. So do you think we'll see a lot of that in this upcoming convention, or do you think it'll be more of a return to previous conventions like 2016 and beforehand?
This is a really important question that you've raised. I think it's going to be more like 2020 than people realize, because the Democrats, I think the Republicans as well, feel that COVID kind of helped because it let them do even more of a TV show than it used to be, where there was even less room for spontaneity. And they don't want spontaneity.
No.
They want it controlled. So I think you're going to see a lot of kind of packages, slickly put together pieces of propaganda for each of the parties. And it'll be more like 2020 and less like an old convention.
Yeah, I will say, in just reading up for this event, I was thinking, man, I would have loved to have been at any of those conventions where they were actually nominating people and where there was real spontaneity and mystery and so on. It's much more interesting. But nonetheless, the stakes are very high for these TV shows because they do set a tone. I think those conventions, particularly I think the Biden convention, helped them greatly in 2020.
It's hugely important again for saving the republic.
There's a question up in the balcony.
Bit of a follow-up to that. You mentioned that it's now mostly political theater. That in the past the delegates actually pick the nominees. What do you all think about the multiple states are going to be sending uncommitted delegates now to the convention? Is there a historical precedence for this, first of all, and second of all, how do you think that will affect this convention?
Well, not much because both candidates have already secured enough delegates to win. I mean, uncommitted delegates mean more. A lot of states back in '68 sent favorite son delegations to the convention to maintain their maneuverability in the convention. Now the answer is given, and I don't want to, especially because it's in our city, I don't want to completely denigrate the idea of the importance of conventions because they do give you, it is a chance for parties and candidates in particular to tell the story they want to tell about where they want to lead. And you get a significant number of people watching that. That is valuable, but it's just not what it was. It's not, there is this mythology that that these are about nominating candidates. Candidates are nominated by voters. Yeah. This is about essentially codifying it.
Excuse me for interrupting, which I did.
That's okay. I do it all the time.
In theory, there's supposed to be a party platform developed there. And that could be significant, if everything else is decided, they could develop a good party platform which gives people something to run on.
And those fights have been significant.
Yeah.
So one of the signs of the threat that democracy is under is that the Republican Party at its last convention 4 years ago did not even issue a platform. It's become a cult of personality and the platform is now irrelevant. And it'll be interesting to see if they do that again, but that's a very dangerous sign when a political party doesn't even adopt a political platform.
Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Jacob. I'm a second year in the college. And kind of to continue this through line, and this is, I guess, kind of a good endpoint to it, but as we've seen now, the conventions have no political utility in their original intent.
Yes.
And they've seen in recent years since that transition's been made, especially with Obama's speech in 2004, that they can be kind of like kingmakers. Create the new face of the party. And as we reach a new, more disparate media environment, where maybe events like this won't have the wide-ranging impact that they would 20 years ago, will we maybe see the convention as this major political institution, cities bidding for it, a big competition? Is that at risk?
What do you think, Bill?
I think for cities bidding it, first of all, there's very few cities that can handle a big convention. With the number, and Democrats have a lot more delegates usually and other people who come to the convention than the Republicans do. So there aren't a lot of cities that will do it. And there's the risk reward. To be very honest with you, when my brother Rich, when he was mayor in '96 and got the convention, and we had a big sigh of relief after considering the '68 one. So we never thought a convention would come back to Chicago after that. The risk reward is enormous. And for a mayor, any mayor, And the economic boom, to be very frank with you, is questionable. But the risk reward is way out of whack, in my opinion.
Hey, let me
if I had one for mayor in 19, I wouldn't have bid for it.
Did your brother think of 96 as a way to sort of expunge the record from 68?
Yeah.
There's one more question over here from,
Thank you.
Not a student, but.
Well, once upon a time I
Could
was.
be.
Looking around at the young people, my question is going to be what are your thoughts on how we can get the young people more involved in the conventions? And I'll tell you why I asked that. In 1960, I was a 17-year-old flag boy at the Republican National Convention here in Chicago. And as I stood up there in the front holding the flag, 10 feet away from President Eisenhower, it was just amazing to be there. And that's what got me started down the path of my interest in politics and being involved. 4 years later, my fiance and I were present at the 1964 Democratic Convention in Atlantic City, compliments of Bill's brother, Rich, who provided the tickets. And that started her on a political career, and she ended up, as I told Bill yesterday, as the mayor of Glenview for 8 years. So it's very important to get these young people involved, and I just wonder if there are programs to do that I don't know about, or how do we go about getting the young people more involved?
Well, that is a planted question, I think, because the Institute of Politics is deeply involved. We are organizing a series of events around the convention, including a gathering of young people from around the country to talk about engagement, voter engagement, and so you're absolutely right. And as you were asking the question, I was sitting here thinking that I don't want to sound so jaundiced, because the things that happen at conventions, though they aren't what they were, can still have tremendous meaning and can still be incredibly inspiring. I was on the floor when my friend Senator Obama spoke in 2004, and that was a historic speech because it set in motion the events that led to his nomination 4 years later. But it also gave people hope and a sense of direction and a sense of possibility. And the thing about democracy is that some have heard me say this, it's an ongoing struggle between hope and cynicism. And cynicism is pretty easy to find these days. But democracy is our chance to grab the wheel of history and turn it in the direction we see as most appropriate and fitting to build the kind of future we want. And at conventions, we discuss those things. And I was inspired to politics by John F. Kennedy coming to my neighborhood in 1960. I was 5 years old making a speech. And I didn't even know what the speech meant, but it seemed really important. I've since read it on Google. But now, is that a question? That's probably someone telling me to wrap up. Okay. Well, I hope that we have a great convention here in the city, and I hope that we do find inspiration in it. And I hope that it is a peaceful convention in which ideas are shared and debated. But yeah, to the young people here, you're going to craft the conventions of the future. So take notes and do it better. And the stories we told today inspired me of what happened at those conventions. So even under in the new context, there are possibilities here that we should work toward. Anyway, thank you for coming. Good night.